Hello, and welcome to the channel. Today, we're diving into a surprisingly peaceful question. What did medieval gardeners really do all day, from the break of dawn to the quiet hush of evening? How did these gardeners spend their time? What did they plant? What tools did they use? And how did their work shape the world around them? Let's explore their quiet, earthy world together, step by step, in this gentle journey through the past. In the quiet hush before sunrise, when the sky is still the color of slate and the air clings with the cool breath of night, the first signs of life begin to stir in the garden. Not a grand garden of roses and fountains, but a simple patch of earth tucked behind a low cottage wall, damp with dew and softened by centuries of tending hands. Here, in the very earliest hours of day, a woman kneels in the soil. Her skirts gathered around her knees, her fingers buried deep in the cool brown earth. Her name has been forgotten by time, like so many others, but her work remains. She is not alone in history. She stands among countless others who rose before the sun, not for leisure, but for survival, their gardens not ornamental but essential, as necessary as the breath they drew or the water they fetched from the well. The garden in these earliest mornings is a place of deep silence, broken only by the sound of wind nudging the trees, a bird calling once from a hedge, the faint creak of a wooden gate swinging closed. Her basket rests nearby, empty still, waiting to be filled with leaves and roots and herbs. The soil is soft and dark, worked by years of compost and ash and clippings, shaped by the memory of the women who came before her. She knows where to place each seed, not from a book, but from memory, passed down in quiet instruction. This row for cabbage, this mound for squash, this edge for thyme and wormwood. It is not a science, not exactly, but a rhythm. She listens to the earth the way one listens to an old song, familiar yet alive with something new each time. When she digs, it is not hurried. When she waters, it is not wasteful. There is purpose in every movement, quiet devotion in every handful of earth. She does not speak, but the garden speaks to her. In the tilt of a leaf, she sees thirst. In the curl of a root, she sees hunger. In the way the morning mist lingers just a little longer, in the hollow behind the hedge. She knows the rain will not come today. These are not facts to be recorded in books, but truths etched in the bones of those who tend the land. And as the light begins to soften, brushing the tops of the trees with pale gold, the garden awakens. Bees, lazy with cold, hum between blossoms. A cat slinks through the rows, brushing past lavender and sage. Somewhere beyond the low stone wall, the rest of the world stirs, a fire lit, a bucket drawn from a well, footsteps crunching the gravel of a path. But here, within the garden, time is slower. The past and present breathe together. It is a space outside of urgency, outside of spectacle, where a woman and the earth meet in quiet understanding. She does not think of herself as a gardener, not in the way we might name her now. She is simply doing what needs to be done, to grow food, to feed children, to survive winter, to keep something alive. In this patch of ground henned by thyme and nettles, shaped by her hands and her mother's and her grandmother's, she is part of something larger than herself, an inheritance not of jewels, but of seeds, of knowing when to dig and when to wait, of understanding the language of roots and shadows and light. And when the sun finally crests the horizon, turning the dew to silver and the leaves to green, she rises slowly, with knees stiff and hands coated in earth. She gathers her basket, now heavy with early greens and fragrant herbs, and steps back toward the kitchen door. Behind her, the garden remains quiet again, but not still. It is already preparing for the next breath, the next seed, the next story. In that small space of soil and sky, 1,000 years whisper, and the garden listens. Beneath the soft morning light, after the gathering is done and the kitchen begins to fill with the scent of herbs, there comes another rhythm, older still, the turning of the soil. It is not planting season, not yet, but the ground must be readied before seeds can rest. The earth must be stirred, must be awakened from its winter sleep. And so she returns, the woman from before, with a different task, slower and heavier. The spade rests in her hand, worn smooth by years of use, its edge dulled not by carelessness but by devotion. She stands at the edge of a narrow plot, looking, not with eyes of judgment, but with patience. She knows this ground. She knows where it floods in spring and where the frost lingers longest. She remembers the dry years, the wet years, the seasons when everything came too early or too late. The soil is part of her story, just as she is part of its. She presses the spade into the earth and turns the first clump. It lifts easily, steaming slightly in the cold morning air, and falls in a soft crumble. The smell is rich, dark, familiar. Not dirt, but life. Beneath the surface, worms coil and twist, shy from the light. Reminders of the work that never stops, even beneath the snow. This process is slow. There is no rush. She works in rows, methodical and steady, resting when needed, letting her breath match the pace of the task. There is comfort in this repetition, a kind of prayer without words. Her muscles remember what her mind does not always need to say. Lift, turn, breathe. Each section of soil she turns carries its own memory. The place where the carrots grew too thin, the corner where the beets swelled fat and sweet, the row where a child once helped, laughing at worms, clapping her hands at a toad startled from its hiding place. That child is older now, perhaps gone, but her small footprints remain buried beneath layers of seasons. The earth remembers everything, and the woman, older now than she once was, continues the conversation with her spade and silence. Sometimes, as she works, she speaks not aloud, but in her mind to the women who came before her, to her mother who showed her how to turn the soil with care, not force, to her grandmother who said the land would never lie if you listened closely. She thinks of them as she works, not in sorrow, but in solidarity. Their hands, too, were calloused, their backs, too, ached in the chill. They, too, knew the satisfaction of finishing a row, of looking back over dark, clean furrows and feeling something ancient settle into place. Above her, the sky begins to shift. The light is fuller now, more golden than gray. The birds have returned, chirping low and steady. She pauses and wipes her brow with the back of her hand, then kneels to crumble a clump of earth between her fingers. It breaks softly, falling like cake, and she nods to herself. The soil is ready, not yet planted, not yet asked to bloom, but prepared. That, she knows, is the beginning of everything. The turning soil is not glamorous. It is not painted in history, books, or stitched into royal tapestries, but it is the bedrock of life. Without it, nothing grows. Without this labor, there is no harvest. And though the world forgets the names of those who bend and turn and dig, the garden does not. The land does not. It remembers, in every seed that takes root, in every stalk that reaches toward the sun, in every loaf of bread and bowl of soup and newborn lamb that survives the winter. The memory of this work endures, and so the woman stands, pressing her palm to the earth one last time. She smiles faintly. Her work is quiet, but it is sacred. The soil has turned, the garden breathes. The story continues. There is a silence to the moment before planting, when the ground lies freshly turned and the tools rest quietly at the edge of the garden. The woman sits for a moment in the low sun, her palms dusted with soil, her skirt damp at the knees. In her lap rests a wooden bowl worn smooth with time, filled not with jewels or coins, but with something far more precious, seeds, tiny things, light as whispers, hardly more than dust and memory. Yet inside each one is a blueprint of life, waiting for warmth, for water, for care, waiting for the right hand, the right time, the right touch. She lifts one between her fingers and holds it up to the light. It is no larger than the moon of a fingernail, dry and silent, but ancient in its promise. This one will be a bean curling up a stake with thick green leaves. That one will be a cabbage, slow to grow but sweet beneath its pale green wrapping. Another will be lettuce, quick and eager, turning sunlight into tenderness. She knows each, one by sight, by feel. Some are saved from last year's harvest, carefully dried and stored in paper packets tucked in the kitchen drawer. Others are gifted, traded with neighbors, passed down from generations, whispered about as though they hold secrets. Perhaps they do. She begins the planting slowly. Her finger presses into the soft row, making a dent no deeper than the last joint. A seed drops in. She covers it gently, not with force, but with familiarity, the way one might tuck in a sleeping child. And again, press, drop, cover. The rhythm is calm, without hurry, and the bowl in her lap grows lighter with each pass. She hums under her breath, a song without words, something her grandmother once sang while sowing turnips, something her mother whispered while planting dill. The tune is old, older than she is, and it fits the moment like a second skin. The air smells different now, still of soil, yes, but also of something else, something beginning. There is no green yet, no visible change. But beneath the surface, where the eye cannot see, something stirs, a shell softens. A root begins to think about where to go. A seed decides that it is time. That is the quiet magic of this chapter in the garden story. It is not a moment of transformation, not yet, but it is the promise of it, the hushed vow that something will grow. As she moves down the row, the woman pauses to straighten her back. The sun has climbed higher. A breeze slips through the orchard, rattling the bare branches. She looks at her bowl nearly empty now and smiles, not because the work is done, but because it has begun. Because in this simple act, she has written a future she may not see, but which she believes in anyway. When the bowl is empty, she brushes her hands clean and stands. Around her, the soil lies soft and dark, patterned with tiny furrows. Nothing green yet, nothing blooming, but the seeds are there, sleeping just below the surface, waiting, and she knows, from years past and years before that they will wake. With sun, with rain, with patience, they will wake. There is a comfort in that, in knowing that something so small can become something so large. That something held once in the palm can one day feed a family. Shaded doorway scent the air with blossoms. She does not need to see it all to believe in it. The planting is enough. The placing of one seed after another, one careful hope pressed into the ground. That is how things begin, not with grandeur, but with quiet hands and steady breath. The woman turns back toward the house. The bowl swings at her side, light now empty and clean behind her. The rows lie waiting. Ahead of her, the kettle waits on the stove, but beneath her, just beneath the surface of the soil, a story has begun. And though the world may never know her name, the garden does. The seeds do. And they remember her every time they bloom. The sun has climbed gently through the morning sky, not harsh yet, but warm enough to rouse the bees and dry the mist from the garden's edge. The soil, freshly turned and newly planted, now waits for its second gift, water. Not too much, not too little, just enough to tell the seeds it is safe to wake. The woman returns with a copper watering can, its spout long and slender, its sides dented with years of use. It catches the light as she walks, the water inside sloshing softly like a whisper. She moves slowly, carefully, not to waste a drop, each motion deliberate, as if speaking a language older than words. There was a time long ago when people did not water gardens. They waited for the rains, watched the skies, read the clouds like scripture, but even then, they knew how to gather. Water dug channels, shaped clay jars, wove reeds into baskets. Now, here in her small garden, the woman does not wait. She gives what she can, as her mother did before her, and her grandmother before that. She begins at the top of the row, tilting the can until the water slips from the spout in a thin, glistening arc. It lands softly, darkening the soil, soaking into the furrow where a seed sleeps. She moves along the line, one careful pour at a time, Not flooding, never rushing. Just enough. The sound is soft water meeting dust, soil sighing as it drinks. The earth does not resist. It welcomes the moisture like an old friend. Steam rises faintly in the warmth. The smell is rich and clean, part earth, part memory. Watches as the color of the soil deepens, becomes something more alive. And though there is nothing yet to see above ground, she knows what is happening below. The seed, dry and hard just hours before, begins to swell. Its shell softens. Its first invisible root reaches out like a hand in the dark. The garden has begun to breathe. She pauses to rest. Setting the watering can at her feet, a bird sings. From the hedgerow, a bee stumbles through the rosemary. The wind picks up, just enough to rustle the leaves of the pear tree overhead. These sounds are not loud. They are not meant to be. They are the hum of life continuing. She looks out over the rows, where the soil now glistens slightly in the sun. It is a quiet kind of beauty, not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that stays with you long after the moment has passed. She lifts the can again and moves to the next row. The weight of the water shifts in her arm. The muscles remember the motion, even if her thoughts are elsewhere. Perhaps she is thinking of the dry year, when the well ran low, and she had to carry each drop from the stream. Perhaps she remembers her mother doing the same, her hands cracked from the cold, her breath visible in the morning air. Or perhaps she is simply here in this moment, with the sound of water and wind and the pulse of the earth beneath her feet. By the time the last row is watered, the sun has risen high enough to warm the top of the garden wall. The can is empty. Her arms are tired, but the work is done, for now. She carries the can back toward the house, its weight gone but its purpose fulfilled. Behind her, the garden glows not with flowers, not yet, but with readiness. The soil is dark and damp. The seeds are nestled in place. The promise of growth has been made. And tomorrow or the next day, when the first green thread pushes through the surface, she will remember this moment, not because it was dramatic, but because it was necessary. Because without water, even the best seeds cannot rise. Without care, even the most fertile soil lies silent. The woman steps inside, her skirts brushing the doorway, her hands still damp, and in the garden the dust settles. The soil cools, and something begins. In the cool of the shed, tucked behind the garden wall, the tools wait. Their handles are smooth from years of use, their blades dulled and sharpened in equal measure, their edges nicked with memory. There is no chatter here, no movement, just the quiet stillness of objects at rest. A spade leans against the beam, its wooden shaft darkened by 100 mornings. A hoe rests beside it, its iron head worn thin where soil has pushed back year after year. A coil of twine hangs from a nail, looped and waiting, and beside it, a pair of shears with rust at the hinge, quiet as folded wings. The woman steps inside, ducking slightly as she passes through the low door. Light filters through the slats in the wall, casting pale bars across the floor. Dust floats in the beams, catching the soft gold of morning. She sets the empty watering can down with care, its bottom thudding gently against the worn planks. Round her, the air smells of earth and oil, of old rope and dry wood, of the past held still in a single breath. These tools are not new, they are not polished, but they have served. She reaches for the broom and sweeps the threshold, small strokes, to brush away the damp leaves the wind has blown in. She does not rush. There is time. The tools do not need her voice to know their purpose. They are quiet, and in their quietness, there is dignity. Once, her father hung each one in its place, with careful hands, labeling the hooks with ink that has long since faded. She remembers him explaining the value of a sharp edge, the grace of balance, the difference between the weight of oak and ash. She remembers her mother polishing the shears, her sleeve dark with oil. These were lessons taught without lectures, lessons absorbed through watching, through repetition, through the rhythm of seasons. She picks up a trowel, turning it in her palm. Its blade is curved, slightly uneven from years of digging. There is a small chip in the metal, but it still fits her hand as it always has. With it she planted her first bulbs. With it she marked the rows of carrots and onions when she was still a child. It is not elegant, but it is hers. She sets it back down, its shape outlined in dust. The shelves above hold more than tools. There are seed packets half empty, tied with string, a jar of old nails, a spool of linen thread, a folded cloth that once covered seedlings on cold nights. Each item is small, but together they make a memory, one that spans decades, silent and steady. This is not a place of grandeur. It is not made to impress. It is a place of usefulness, of quiet preparation. She reaches for a cloth and wipes the blade of the hoe, removing a smear of soil left from last week's work. The motion is slow, almost reverent. To care for a tool is to care for the work it will do, to honor the hands that used it before. Outside, a bird sings from the pear tree, and the wind shifts through the branches with a sound like breath. She pauses, listening not for anything specific, but because it is in her nature now to listen. When the shed is in order again, she stands in the doorway and looks out over the garden. The rows are dark with moisture. The air smells of green. Things waking, the tools behind her rest once more, clean, quiet, waiting. They will not call to her. They never have, but when she reaches for them, they will be ready. They always are. And so she steps back into the light, her palms brushed free of dust, her breath steady, her mind calm. In the garden time moves, slowly, but it moves, and the tools, though still, are never forgotten. They are the memory of labor, of care, of hands that shaped the earth not just for beauty, but for sustenance. They are the proof that something was built here, not with force, but with quiet attention. And in their silence, they hold that history still. By early afternoon, the sun begins to press more firmly against the garden walls, and the rows of damp soil, freshly planted and carefully watered, glisten under the strengthening light. The woman steps back from the edge of her work, eyes narrowing slightly as she scans her efforts, not with critique, but with a quiet sense of completion. The air has shifted. It is no longer the crisp breath of morning, but the warm exhale of midday. She wipes her palms along the sides of her apron, then walks toward the edge of the orchard, where an old pear tree casts a lacework of shade upon the grass. It has stood here longer than the garden itself. This tree, older than her, older than the stone steps worn smooth at the cottage door. Its branches arch wide and welcoming, gnarled in the way that only time can shape, and beneath its green canopy lies a patch of coolness, a soft haven from the weight of the day. She settles into the crook of a root that curves naturally like a seat, her back resting against the trunk. A sigh slips from her lips, not of exhaustion, but of release, the kind that comes only after the morning's work is done, after the soil has been turned and the seeds tucked in like promises whispered to the earth. Round her, the garden hums. Bees drift lazily between rosemary and borage, their paths unhurried. A dragonfly flickers past, a thin flash of blue light. Somewhere in the distance, a gate creaks open and closed again. The rhythm of life, continuing in other homes, other plots. But here, beneath the tree, the world slows to a pause. It is a place of pause, of reflection, not sleep, but stillness. The shade dapples across her hands and skirts, dancing with each breeze that stirs the upper branches. Leaves flutter like pages being turned slowly, carefully. The sunlight filters through in soft patches, casting patterns on her arms and the worn cloth of her apron. She watches the dust in the air, the way it moves like fine smoke, like something between here and gone. She has known this tree since she was small, climbed its limbs in youth, gathered its fruit in baskets, leaned against it in moments of grief and moments of joy. She has seen it bare and blooming, in storm and in silence, and each year it remains, not unchanged, but ever itself. She thinks, as she rests, of how much in life is like this tree, quiet, steady, often overlooked, but rooted, resilient. She thinks of the garden, of the seeds now resting beneath the soil, of the water soaking into their shells, of the tools cleaned and stored, of the way the morning passed not in noise but in purpose. There is a rhythm to this life, and it is not loud, it is not quick, but it is full, rich in the way bread is rich, in the way firelight is rich, in the way hands remember what words forget. She closes her eyes for a moment, listens, not for anything in particular, but simply to be part of the hush. The tree above her creaks softly, a language older than speech. The grass bends with the breeze. The sun shifts, its path overhead slow and unwavering. Nothing is urgent here. Nothing is pressing. All that is needed is this: the work done well, the garden set in motion, the heart resting in shade. When she opens her eyes again, the sky is still blue, the garden still quiet, the tree still holding its place in the world. She rises, brushing her skirt, placing her hand briefly on the bark as if to say thank you, not aloud, not even in thought but in gesture. And then she walks back toward the house, each step measured and soft. Behind her, the pear tree stands, its shade spilling across the earth like an open hand, and within it, the memory of 1,000 afternoons just like this, held gently in its roots. The house is still as she steps inside, its stone walls holding the coolness of morning even as the day outside begins to hum with warmth. Her boots find the familiar creak in the floorboards near the threshold. The air within carries the faint scent of rosemary from her apron, of loam on her hands, of the hush that settles after steady labor. She sets the watering can by the door and glances toward the hearth, a quiet place, but never forgotten. Though the garden is tended and the tools put away, the heart of the home still waits to be woken. She kneels before the hearth with a practiced ease, one hand reaching for the small pile of kindling stacked neatly in the corner. The hearth is not large. It is not grand. It does not boast the sweeping brickwork of great halls or the carved mantels of manor homes, but it is deep and strong, built by hands long since returned to dust. The soot-stained stones bear witness to every winter past, every loaf baked, every child warmed in a woolen blanket by its side. Here in the center of her quiet home, heat has always meant more than comfort. It has meant survival, continuity, belonging. She arranges the kindling with care, slipping thin shavings of bark beneath the twigs, laying them in a small teepee as her mother taught her. No rush. The fire, like the soil, cannot be forced, it must be invited. From a jar on the shelf, she draws out a handful of old matchsticks, their ends blackened, their sides worn smooth. But today she uses the flint, striking stone against steel. She sends a brief scatter of sparks downward until, at last, one catches, and a fragile flame begins to flicker. She leans in and breathes slow and measured until the flame steadies, then grows, licking at the kindling, warming the cold belly of the hearth. The fire grows not in haste but in confidence, the way morning light grows on a wall or a song gathers strength in the throat. She adds a log, nothing large, just enough to keep it speaking. Soon the smell of wood smoke begins to thread through the room, familiar and soft, like the hem of an old coat. The shadows on the walls shift as light begins to dance again in the center of the home. The fire doesn't roar. It murmurs. It breathes. Its light is golden, catching in the curve of a wooden spoon, in the glint of a copper kettle. It casts no harsh lines, only warmth. She settles onto the low stool nearby and warms her hands, her fingers curled loosely toward the flames. There is no need to cook yet, no bread to rise or pot to simmer. But the fire brings something more than heat. It brings a stillness, a memory of all the days before, when laughter echoed in this room, when voices were young and hands clumsy, when stories were told with half-finished words and full hearts. She remembers her father sitting just there, a carved pipe resting in his palm. She remembers her mother humming, shelling peas in rhythm with the ticking of the wall clock. She remembers herself smaller, knees pulled to her chest, watching the fire as if it could speak. Perhaps it did. Perhaps it still does. She reaches for the kettle and sets it near the coals. Soon it will hum, the water inside turning restless, then whispering, then singing, and with it tea, not grand, not ceremonial, just warm, a comfort brewed from mint and thyme and maybe a curl of dried apple, saved from autumn. She will drink it in silence, watching the shadows lengthen, feeling the day shift from its middle toward its end. The hearth is not simply a place to burn wood. It is the gathering point of the unseen, where the labor of the garden meets the rest of the body, where the outer work quiets and the inner life stirs. Here, the seasons are not marked by calendars, but by the temperature of the stone, by the thickness of the soup, by the kind of wood chosen from the pile outside. Here, time slows, not in sleep, but in presence. The fire is not bright. It does not shout, but it holds, it endures. She watches the flames curl and stretch, the logs settling with a soft sigh. The kettle hums. Outside, the world continues. Leaves stir, bees return to their hives, clouds drift low across the sky, but here, within these walls, the fire keeps time, not with ticking or tolling, but with breath, with warmth, with memory. And as the shadows gather and the firelight grows more golden, she leans back in her chair and closes her eyes, just for a moment. The garden sleeps beneath its blanket of soil. The tools rest in the shed. The seeds dream in the dark, and in the hearth, the flame keeps vigil, quiet and strong. Evening settles like a shawl across the shoulders of the house, soft and unhurried, brushing its light fingers against the garden wall, the orchard fence, the old stone path that winds gently to the door. Inside, the light from the fire still glows low now, steady enough to warm the room and catch in the lines of the wood grain on the table. The woman stands in the kitchen, moving without hurry, her body knowing what to reach for before her mind calls it forth. A loaf of bread, cooled since morning, a small round of cheese wrapped in linen, a clay dish of salted beans, soaked and stewed earlier with a bay leaf, and a clove of garlic pulled fresh from the garden's edge. These are not feasts, they are not banquets, they are what the earth gives when asked gently. She sets the table for one, not out of loneliness, but out of rhythm, a single place. A folded cloth napkin, the chipped ceramic bowl that has belonged to this kitchen longer than she has. There is no performance in the meal, no pretense, just food, simple and real, placed with care. She slices the bread slowly, the crust giving way beneath the knife with a soft crackle. The inside is warm still, though it has sat for hours, its heart alive with yeast and patience. She ladles the beans into the bowl, their steam rising in small ghostly tendrils. A sprig of thyme rests on top, not for show, but because the garden offered it. She pours herself a cup of the herbal tea from the kettle that hummed earlier by the hearth. It smells of mint and dried lemon peel, gathered last summer and hung in bunches from the ceiling beams. The cup is warm in her hands, not hot, and she carries it to the table as the fire pops gently behind her. Outside, dusk deepens, and a robin's song carries briefly on the wind before vanishing into the hedgerow. The meal is quiet, not somber, not empty, but hushed like a prayer spoken with hands instead of words. She eats slowly, not to savor, but because her body is tired in the good way, tired from bending, from carrying, from tending, from rising with the sun and following it across the sky. Each bite is an echo of the morning's work. The bread, from flour she ground herself, the beans planted weeks ago, the herbs once held in dirt beneath her nails. This is not convenience, this is connection. The spoon clinks softly against the bowl. The cheese crumbles gently beneath the knife. The tea steams and curls upward like a story unwritten. She thinks of nothing in particular as she eats, just the day as it was, the soil beneath her hands, the way the light moved through the leaves, the sound of water in the can, the smell of rosemary on her fingers. When the meal is done, she does not rush to clear the table. She sits for a while longer, hands resting on the cloth, eyes drifting toward the window where the last of the light fades to a gentle violet. The house holds its breath in the pause. The fire murmurs low. The dishes wait without complaint. She moves slowly, rinsing the bowl, wiping the crumbs from the board, folding the cloth napkin. The kitchen returns to stillness, not because it must, but because it can. This is not the kind of meal that stories are written about, but it is the kind that lingers, the kind that roots a person to a place, that leaves behind not spectacle but peace, the kind of meal that says, "You have done enough, you are fed." The garden sleeps, the fire keeps, and tomorrow the work will begin again, not with noise, but with hands in soil, with breath in air, with the quiet promise of another seed planted, another loaf risen, another meal taken in calm. She steps away from the table, her shadow long behind her, and carries the stillness of the evening into the next room, where the candle waits to be lit, and the night waits to be gently welcomed. Night does not fall in this house. It drapes. It enters gently through the windows, slipping over the sill like a tide at rest, folding into the corners and softening the edges of things. The day has exhaled its last breath, and in its place quiet settles, not silence, for the fire still murmurs, and the beams still creak as they shift in the cooling air, but quiet, the kind that holds the weight of stillness without feeling empty. She moves through the room with the softness of someone who knows where every creak waits beneath the floorboards, her feet bare, her hands clean, her breath unhurried. From the mantel, she takes a single beeswax candle, its surface dimpled and honey-colored. She carries it to the table, where the firelight no longer reaches, and strikes a match. The sound is small, sharp, and brief, and then the flame curls into being. Soft gold within soft gold. The candle does not flicker, not at first. It steadies quickly, as if it too knows the rules of this house, the shape of this hour. Shadows bloom across the walls, not ominous, but familiar, like old friends returning after a long day. She lifts her sewing basket from beneath the sideboard, where it rests beside a folded quilt. The basket creaks as it opens, its hinges old, but faithful. Inside, spools of thread wound in faded paper, a thimble polished from years of use, a small pair of scissors that snip cleanly and neatly, and fabric, cotton, linen. Straps saved from dresses long outgrown or aprons too worn to mend. She selects a square of pale blue cloth, sets it in her lap, and begins to stitch. The needle moves steadily up and down through the weave with a whisper. She does not count stitches. She does not rush. The cloth gathers beneath her fingers, drawn gently into something new. There is something in this actor rhythm, a hum. The world outside may turn on machines and schedules and noise, but here it turns on thread and time and the quiet patience of hands. The candle flickers now, catching in the sheen of the needle, drawing light into the folds of the fabric. She hums, though she does not realize it, a tune her mother once sang, without words, just a line that rose and fell like a lullaby for the hands. The needle moves, the cloth grows, the room breathes. This too is part of the garden, not of soil and seed, but of care, of tending. The stitch that holds the hem, the patch that mends the tear, the thread that binds one thing to another. It is a kind of growing, this work, a way of making something whole again. The fire dims slowly behind her, burning low now, its heart buried in embers. The candle holds its flame close, as if mindful not to disturb the hush. Time passes, but not with urgency, only with grace. When the cloth is finished, its edges turned, it seems even, she folds it and sets it aside. The basket closes with a soft click, the thread wound back in place, the scissors return to their nest. She cups the candle in one hand and rises, her shadow following close at her feet. The room is warm still, though the fire gives no more than a gentle glow. She moves toward the hallway, the candle casting long light along the walls, revealing not dust or disorder but calm. The day is done. The earth is quiet, the house rests, and so does she. And as the door closes softly behind her, the candle's flame dips once, then steadies again, alone but undisturbed. It will burn a while longer, and then go out, not with a rush of smoke, but with a sigh, leaving behind the scent of beeswax and the memory of cloth, a final note in a song of quiet care, a promise that, come morning, light will return not just to the sky, but to the hands that wait and the work that welcomes them. The stairs are narrow and old, the kind built before measurements were written down, when each step was shaped by an hand and the tilt of the house itself. They creak beneath her, not loudly, but with the easy complaint of wood that has borne the weight of many years and many feet. She carries the candle before her like a small star, and its light glows on the walls, catching in the edges of framed sketches, in the weave of the linen curtain that sways faintly at the landing. Up here, the air is cooler, not cold, but thinned of the day's warmth, touched by the breath of trees outside and the hush of the night pressing against the windows. Her bedroom lies beneath the slope of the roof, tucked gently beneath the eaves, where the ceiling angles low, and the wind sometimes plays across the shingles. The room is small. It holds only what is needed: a bedstead of plain wood, its corners rounded by time, a chest at the foot of it, a single shelf of books, and a pitcher and basin set upon a table. The candlelight lays itself across the quilt, the old wool one stitched in pieces long ago, faded but sound. It pulls in the folds of the white curtains, shimmers briefly across the brass latch of the window before settling into stillness. She sets the candle down and opens the window just a crack. The air that slips through smells of damp earth and cool leaves. A moth drifts by, briefly brushing the pane, then vanishing into the night. Beyond the garden the orchard slumbers, and beyond that the hills roll softly under a silver-streaked sky. She breathes in. The scent of smoke from the hearth lingers, faintly in her hair, and the soft mint of the tea still rests on her tongue. Her body is heavier now, not with burden, but with the full weight of a day well lived. She changes slowly, folding her clothes with care and placing them atop the chest. Her nightdress is simple, cotton-worn, thin, and smoothed by years of washing. She moves like someone who has no need to rush, whose world does not run by clocks or alarms, but by sun and season and the quiet instincts of the body. She pours water from the pitcher into the basin and washes her face, the cloth cool and kind against her skin. Drops patter gently as she wrings it out. The room smells faintly of lavender, tucked long ago into the folds of the quilt, a whisper of summer still hiding in the linen. When she finally slips beneath the covers, the mattress shifts softly beneath her weight. The quilt folds over her shoulders, and she draws it close, one hand resting lightly at her chest. The candle flickers on the table, casting long shadows that stretch up into the beams above. Outside, an alcove's once distant and calm. The world beyond the window is velvet dark now, scattered with stars, quiet in a way that asks nothing of her. She watches the candle until her eyelids grow heavy, the flame blurring into a golden smudge, then a glow, then a memory of light, and when at last he blows it out, the room falls into darkness, not empty, not hollow, but full of quiet breath and the soft sound of linen shifting. The house settles around her like a shell, the kind that holds every sound of the sea within it. The garden sleeps beneath the soil. The tools are still. The fire is gone. And in the bed beneath the eaves, she dreams not of far places or grand things, but of earth and air and hands in the soil of another morning to come, and the gentle rhythm that will greet her when it does. Morning does not arrive with urgency here. It comes as a slow unfolding, a soft rinsing of darkness with the pale gray of dawn. The air holds its breath at first, and then gently begins again the faintest rustle of leaves, the sleepy hum of wings, the far-off bark of a dog echoing like a memory. Inside the little house, beneath the angled roof and quiet beams, he stirs, her eyes open not from noise, but from the subtle shift of light against the curtain. There is no alarm, no bell, only the promise of day, seeping in at the edges. The quilt is warm, her body still wrapped in the hush of sleep, but the soil is waiting, always waiting. She swings her feet to the floor, feeling the chill of the wood, grounding herself in its coolness, the weight of her own body returning to her gently. There is a stretch, a soft breath. A moment before she stands, the morning begins with water, always water, from the pitcher into the basin, from the basin to her face and hands. The cold stings for a second, and then clears. Then the scent of soap, the rough weave of linen, the firm braiding of her hair as she watches her own reflection in the small mirror, not for beauty, but for readiness. This is not a face for display, it is a face for work, for weather, for wind and sun and turning seasons. Downstairs, the hearth still holds some warmth. Embers shift when she touches them, and she adds a few pieces of wood, not rushed, not careless. The fire begins again in its own time, licking softly at the bark, spreading into a comfortable glow. Breakfast is simple oats cooked slowly, tea poured carefully, eaten at the wooden table that holds the marks of many mornings before. No voices fill the room, only the creak of the spoon in the bowl, the click of ceramic, the sigh of heat rising from the cup, and then the boots, thick-soled, worn to her shape, tugged on with a practice hand. The apron tied, the coat pulled from its hook, its sleeves still holding the curve of her arms. She steps outside into a world fresh with dew, where every blade of grass holds a drop of sky. The light has turned now no longer gray, but gold at the edges. The air smells of wet earth and new leaves, of things waiting just beneath the surface. The garden is still in shadow, but the path is familiar, stones worn smooth, a gate that groans as it opens. She bends to pick up the spade where it leans against the fence. Its handle fits her palm like an old friend. The soil here is dark, rich, cool beneath the surface. She turns it over carefully, methodically, breaking the crust of night to let the day in. Worms wriggle in the wake of the spade. The scent rises deep, almost sweet, full of memory. This is where the year begins again, not on calendars, but in this moment, the first turning of earth. It is not dramatic, is not loud, but it is everything. The soil shifts, breathes, welcomes her hands. She does not speak. She does not need to. Here in the softened square of her garden, her work begins not with plans or words, but with this ancient gesture, digging, loosening, preparing the ground for what will come. On her, the world awakens in pieces. A robin lands on the edge of the bed, watching her with quick eyes. A squirrel chatters from the trees. The sun climbs higher, brushing gold onto the tops of the hedgerows. But she does not look up yet. Her hands are deep in the earth, and the earth in turn begins to open. There is no rush, only rhythm. The rhythm of breath and blade, of shovel and sigh, of centuries behind her and seasons ahead. This is not new. This is not novel. It is older than names, older than the walls of her house, older than the road that leads past the garden gate. And it is hers. The soil crumbles gently between her fingers, and beneath it, something stirs, quiet, slow, patient. The beginning of roots, the memory of seeds, the promise of everything. By late morning, the sun has climbed high enough to warm the garden wall and glint off the edges of the watering can. The rows she turned earlier rest now beneath a dusting of mulch, tucked in and smoothed over, as if the soil itself needed sleep. She stands back for a moment, wiping her hands on her apron, the smell of earth clinging to her fingertips. There is always more to be done, tools to clean, compost to turn, stakes to mend, but the body has its own rhythm, and hers tells her now to pause, not to stop entirely, but to shift. She walks slowly toward the cottage, her boots knocking softly against the stones inside. The air is cool again, shaded and still. The hearth has burned low, the fire reduced to its quiet bones, but there is no need to stir it just yet. She washes her hands in the basin, watching the soil swirl away in rivulets, brown fading to pink, pink to clear. Then she dries them, folds the cloth neatly, and turns toward the side table in the corner of the room, the one with the shallow drawer beneath its smooth, worn surface. She opens it carefully. Inside lies a bundle wrapped in linen, folded tightly, and tied with a length of blue thread. It is not large, no more than a square of fabric in her two hands, but the drawer always closes softly after it. She carries it to the table and lays it out, untying the knot with slow fingers. The cloth opens like a story, crease by crease. Inside are small things, quiet things. A letter pressed flat and faintly yellowed, a photograph faded at the corners, the faces barely more than shadows, a lock of hair wrapped in parchment, and at the center a thimble dented slightly at the rim, its silver dulled with age. She does not handle them as one might relics. She does not weep or whisper. She simply looks, as one might look at the sea or the sky or the shape of a mountain. They've always known. Each piece has its own memory. The letter written in a hand that once matched hers, the photograph taken in the spring when the orchard was young and the house wore ivy like a shawl, the thimble worn by a woman who stitched long into the evenings while the wind sang outside. These are not heirlooms of wealth. They are weightless with meaning, roots of a different kind. She picks up the thimble and turns it in her palm, feeling the way her thumb still knows where the dent lies. She has her own now, of course, newer and smoother, but this one fits her all the same. She holds it for a while, then sets it back. The cloth is refolded with equal care, not rushed, not mechanical, as if each crease must remember the last. When she ties the thread again, the knot sits where it always does. She places the bundle back in the drawer and closes it with the same softness, the way one closes a gate at dusk, quietly, gently, knowing it will open again when it's needed. There are things in life that do not move quickly, things that remain even when everything else shifts. The scent of dried lavender pressed between pages, the texture of handwriting in ink that has long since dried, the knowledge that you come from somewhere even if the names are gone and the voices are silent. These things do not ask for attention. They only ask to be kept, and she has kept them, not as burdens, but as anchors. Outside, the wind picks up a little, rattling the leaves on the fig tree near the wall. She stands for a moment, hand resting lightly on the wood of the drawer, not holding on, just remembering. Then she turns, walks back toward the kitchen, and lifts the kettle from the hook. The fire needs feeding, the tea needs making, and the day, like the bundle, must be unfolded slowly, one soft layer at a time. The afternoon deepens, stretching long shadows across the floorboards, softening the edges of the house like water smoothing a stone outside. The wind sways in the hedgerows, shaking petals loose from the early blossoms. They drift, not hurried, not grasping, but graceful, turning slowly in the air before resting on the earth like thoughts too gentle to speak aloud. Inside, the house is still, not empty but full of silence, the kind that settles after a task completed or a door gently closed. She sits by the window, her chair angled just enough to catch the light. In her lap, a book rests open, but she does not read. The pages lie still beneath her fingers, the words waiting patiently, as if knowing they are not needed just yet. Her eyes are on the orchard beyond the glass, where the branches stir like the memory of music, and a pair of sparrows dart in and out of the undergrowth. There is no urgency in their motion, only purpose, the kind of movement that belongs to creatures who trust the day to be long enough. The air in the room carries a faint scent, part wood smoke, part thyme, part something older and harder to name, like dust warmed by sunbeams. It is the smell of stillness, of a space used well, but never rushed. The floor creaks slightly beneath her heel as she shifts her weight. The tea beside her has cooled, forgotten, but not wasted. It will be poured into the garden later, where the mint grows near the stone path. She thinks not of great events or distant worries, or things undone, but of hands, her own folded now in her lap. Her mother's, strong and dry, smelling, always faintly of flour, her grandmother's, with knuckles like knots in wood and nails square from years of turning soil. So many hands all doing the same things in slightly different ways. Picking beans, shelling peas, mending sleeves, holding faces, passing bread. This is the weight of quiet, not a burden, a presence, something that lives beneath the noise of days in the spaces between chores and conversations. It asked for nothing, gives no instruction. It is not a void, but a resting place, a room that holds memory without displaying it. She breathes in. The air is cool against the back of her throat, and when she exhales, the silence deepens, not because she has filled it, but because she has met it. The shadows shift, the light grows thinner. From somewhere nearby, a blackbird sings a single, clear note, just one, then gone. She closes the book, though she never read a word. The cloth cover is warm where it lay against her thigh. She sets it on the table, the sound barely more than a whisper. Then she stands, not because something calls her, but because the quiet has been long enough. It is time to begin the next thing. She crosses the room slowly, brushing her hand along the back of the chair as she goes. Not goodbye, not farewell, just presence. The floor welcomes her weight again. Old boards giving just slightly beneath her steps, and the light follows, as it always does, from the window to the wall, from her shoulder to her shadow. The quiet does not vanish, it follows, soft-footed, folding itself into the fabric of the day. Ready to rest again when the moment returns. It begins before the light, before the birds stir, before the sun rises far enough to touch the tiled roof or glint against the dewdrops resting on the cabbage leaves. The sky is still blue-gray, the color of washed linen hung to dry, and in the hush before the day begins, the world feels smaller, held close like a folded letter never sent. In the garden, breath rises like mist from the ground, soft and slow, and everything waits. She steps into it quietly, boots dabbed from the grass, shawl gathered around her shoulders. The door behind her creaks just slightly, then falls shut with a whisper, and she does not look back. Her hands are already moving, practiced and unhurried, as she gathers the empty trug from its hook and wins her way through the rows. The air smells of wet soil, parsley, and the ghost of last night's ash. Somewhere near the edge of the garden, a bee buzzes drowsily past, too early yet for the full symphony of wings and rustling leaves. The peas are ready. She bends to check the pods, firm, plump, almost sweet to the touch, and begins to gather. Then gently, each one slips free with a soft snap, like thread pulled taut and snipped. The church begins to fill with green. Behind her, the soft rhythmic thuds of fruit falling into wicker mark the progress of another pair of hands, her daughter perhaps, or a neighbor rising early to help. No words are exchanged, only the sound of breath, of footsteps brushing against the earth, and the hush of a garden not yet disturbed by the full sun. It is a quiet choreography, this tending of plants, not loud, not grand, but full of motion and meaning. A hand brushes a leaf to check for pests, fingers pinch away spent blooms, a thumb presses into the soil to test its dampness. Each gesture is rooted in years, passed down like recipes, lullabies. She does not think about it, she simply knows where the water pools after rain, which rows need turning first, when to let a bed rest. The light begins to lift slowly, and with it, the first birds call from the hedges. Just a few notes at first, tentative, as if testing the shape of the morning, but they grow one by one, until the air is full of their presence. Still, the work continues. The onions are pulled gently, dirt clinging to their skins like memory. The lettuce heads are checked, their leaves curled inward like fists relaxing. The mint is trimmed, its sharp scent released into the breeze with every cut. By the time the sun clears the treetops, the garden is awake. Bees move in earnest now, skipping from bloom to bloom. A robin hops along the edge of a raised bed, pausing to cock its head, and the trugs lined neatly on the stone path are filled with the colors of morning. Green peas, pale lettuce, golden onions, a single ripe strawberry resting on top like a jewel. She straightens slowly, one hand pressed to the small of her back, the other shading her eyes as she looks toward the sky. Another day has begun. She does not mark it with bells or ceremony. There is no applause, no witness, only the quiet satisfaction of a task begun in stillness and carried through with care. She lifts the trug and turns toward the house, its windows beginning to glow with warm kitchen light. There, water will be set to boil, bread will be sliced, a handful of mint will steep gently in a ceramic cup. And this, too, is part of the garden, because gardening is not just what is done in the soil. It is what is carried back inside. The rhythm of hands, the hush of observation, the patience of waiting, the gift of attention, given again and again. And in that gift, something grows not only in the earth, but in the self, a quiet rootedness, a steady grace, a knowledge that each morning holds something worth tending, even if only for a while, even if only in silence. She disappears through the door again, into the warmth and clatter of the kitchen, her boots leaving a faint trail of dew on the threshold. Behind her, the garden remains not empty, not paused, but quietly continuing, as it always has, as it always will, the soil turned, the light rising, the day just begun. There were always a few things in the garden that children turned their noses up at. The bitter greens, dandelion, endive, sorrel, chicory. Their names were whispered with a wrinkled brow, their taste sharp on the tongue, something you grew not because you loved it, but because you needed it. These leaves were not flashy. They didn't climb trellises or spill over borders. They didn't draw the bees or burst into golden bloom, but they endured. Through early frosts, through poor soil, through seasons where other crops failed, the bitter greens remained. They were the resilience of the garden, the thread that carried people through lean times. In the spring, when the body still remembered the hunger of winter, they were gathered carefully, washed in cold water, and tossed into soups to wake the blood. In summer, they were braised with vinegar and fat to balance the richness of heavier fare. In autumn, they were stewed with garlic and bean broth, hearty and dark, and in winter they were dried and stored, crumbled into powders that flavored porridge when the cellar grew empty. Grandmothers knew them well. They taught their names with quiet pride, lifting each leaf with thumb and forefinger, pointing out the differences in edge and stem. Children rolled their eyes, but the knowledge sank in anyway, absorbed like sun through skin. These greens were medicine and food and memory. They whispered of older times, when hunger was close and survival was bitter by necessity. In monasteries, monks cultivated them with care, recording their properties in ink, what soothed the liver, what calmed the stomach, what broke a fever. In villages, they were part of lore, bundled with nettles and tied with red thread against illness. And in kitchens, they waited on the windowsill, on the cutting board, in the pot humble and in sun. There is something steady in bitterness, something honest. Sweetness is a pleasure, but bitterness is a lesson. It teaches patience, fortitude, the understanding that not everything nourishing comes easily. In the garden, among the showier plants, the bitter greens waited, not glamorous, not adored, but essential, and somehow always there. When the world turned to ash and smoke, the garden did not vanish, it shrank, perhaps became a window box, a hidden patch behind rubble, a row of cabbages shielded by sheet metal, but it did not die. In wartime, the soil became sacred in a way, not just as memory or heritage, but as lifeline. When ships could no longer bring oranges, when meat was rationed, when flour was stretched with dried potato and lentil, the garden grew into its fullest meaning, survival, victory gardens. They called them small plots in parks, behind churches, even in the bombed-out courtyards of cities. People who had never touched soil with intention before now bent low with spades in hand. Children carried watering cans. Grandmothers offered advice in between sirens. Onions were planted beside lettuce, carrots tucked between rows of beans, marigolds added to keep the pests away. It wasn't about beauty anymore. It was about filling the pot, feeding the child. Stretching the weak. Seed packets were treasures. Instructions were printed in newspapers. Recipes adapted to what could be grown in 6 square feet. There were pamphlets, broadcasts, lectures in schoolrooms and town halls. Grow your own, save waste, share with neighbors. Compost became gospel. Chickens returned to backyards. People learned again what their great-grandparents had always known, that food begins in silence, in dirt and patience. Even in the darkest days, there were gardens, hidden behind barbed wire, on the edge of refugee camps, beside field hospitals. A row of turnips, a handful of herbs, a single vine curling along a broken wall. These small acts were not only resistance, they were remembrance, a way of saying, life continues, even now, even here. And when the war ended, many of those gardens remained. People found they could not go back to forgetting the soil. They had touched something essential. They had grown their own hope, one seed at a time, and the earth, ever forgiving, had answered. In wartime, the garden became both shield and story. It asked for hands and gave back meals. It was never enough, not really, but it was something, a bowl of soup that did not come from a ration card, a tomato that tasted of summer, not fear. In the hardest times, the garden stood its ground. And so did those who planted it. When peace returned, it did not arrive all at once. It seeped in quietly through the absence of sirens, the return of letters, the slow rebuilding of windows and walls. And in that same silence, the garden remained. Some had been started in desperation, others out of duty, but now, with time to breathe, they became something more again. They became places of healing. The soil still remembered the footsteps of those who planted in fear, but now they were joined by children born after the war who knew only stories of blackout curtains and tin can stew. These no hands touched the same earth, but asked different things of it, not just food, but beauty, not just sustenance, but color. Roses returned and lilacs. Nasturtiums curled along fences. Lawns were reseeded, not for goats or hens, but for picnics. And still, the rows of beans and potatoes were planted because no one forgot so quickly what it meant to rely on oneself. Gardening clubs bloomed like the dahlias they tended. Magazines featured monthly advice. Television programs showed viewers how to prune a hedge, build a cold frame, compost with care. There was something deeply comforting in the rhythm of it all, planting, tending, harvesting, repeating. In a world still stitching itself back together, the garden offered a quiet routine that needed no translation. Greenhouses came back into fashion. Window boxes brightened cities. Allotments were expanded. The post-war years were a time of rearranging priorities. And in many homes, the garden became not just a source of food or flowers, but of pride, a proof of what could grow even after destruction, a symbol of resilience. For some, the garden was still a matter of necessity. In rural areas and among families with little wealth, the post-war economy required every penny saved, every carrot grown. But increasingly, gardens became an expression of peace. The return of lavender and thyme, the humming of bees instead of bombers, the quiet sound of a rake on gravel, of a gate gently clicking closed. People planted trees for the children born after. They planted in memory of those who had not returned, and in planting, they dreamed again not only of what was, but of what could be, a future with seasons not measured in loss, but in bloom. And so, the garden remained not out of crisis, but out of love, a gentle insistence that even after war, there could be growth. Not all gardens are private. Some are shared spaces where strangers become neighbors, and soil becomes common ground. After the war and into the shifting decades that followed, the idea of the community garden began to take firmer root. In some places, it had always existed quietly: church plots, village commons, cooperative farms. But now in cities reshaped by industrial life and suburbs stretching into old farmlands, the community plot re-emerged with new purpose. In neighborhoods where backyards were rare and apartment windows opened to concrete, people turned abandoned lots into rows of kale and corn. They pulled weeds from between bricks, built compost bins from old pallets, and mapped out plots with string and hope. Children came with watering cans. Elders brought seed packets wrapped in brown paper. Some spoke different languages. Some had lived in the city all their lives, and some had only just arrived. But in the garden, their differences softened. Tomatoes grew the same in any tongue. There was often a shed, always a bench. Some plots were named Mrs. Nara's sunflowers, George's chili patch, the strawberry corner. Rules were written in fading ink on handmade signs: share tools, respect the rows, leave something behind. Some gardens had waiting lists, others welcomed with open arms. Most survived not because of policy or funding, but because someone showed up with a trowel and refused to let the weeds win. The community garden was not just about harvest, it was about exchange. Recipes traded over zucchini, advice offered with the turn of a spade. It was about laughter, sometimes music, sometimes silence shared among those pulling carrots side by side. In a fast world, it asked for slowness. In a divided one, it offered shared earth thought, and when trouble came, illness, grief, uncertainty, the garden was there, a quiet place to kneel and remember. A place where hands could be busy even when hearts were heavy. Seeds do not ask for explanations. They ask for care. In the community plot, history was grown again, not in textbooks, but in onions and mint, in pots worn by boots, in the hum of bees and the passing of time. It became something more than space. It became connection, a way to belong. One sprout at a time. Not every garden needs land. Some are measured in inches, not acres. In terracotta pots balanced on ledges, in cracked mugs filled with thyme, and long, narrow boxes hung beneath windows that catch the morning sun. For those without yards, without courtyards, without even a shared plot, the garden finds its home where it can, on balconies, in stairwells, along fire escapes that tremble under the weight of summer tomatoes. There is something especially tender about a window box. It is a garden in miniature, curated with care and compromise. The soil is shallow, the light often uneven, the air touched with city soot or salt from distant coasts, and yet life grows. Geraniums lean toward warmth, basil perks up after watering, tiny strawberries blush among green leaves. The gardener learns their small rhythms: when to shade them from the heat, when to pinch back the stems, when to whisper encouragement over fragile blooms. On balconies, larger dreams take root: pots of lavender and cherry tomatoes, vines of peas climbing makeshift trellises tied with string, a corner for salad greens, a shelf for medicinal herbs, a tub repurposed into a tiny lettuce bed. These spaces are not only cultivated for beauty or food, but for peace. A breath of green above the noise, a place to drink tea in the morning or watch the lights flicker on at dusk. Gardens like these ask the gardener to observe closely, to notice how the sun moves across walls, to know which wind brings dryness, which brings rain. They teach patience, and they reward devotion with humble miracles: a new leaf, a first flower, a cluster of ripening fruit no larger than a coin, even a single potted plant on a windowsill, an aloe vera, a jade, a maranta that folds its leaves at night, can be a garden in spirit, a living thing tended by hand, changing slowly with the seasons, asking nothing but presence and care. In cities where concrete reigns, these small gardens become sanctuaries. They soften the edges of steel. They bring birds to perch. They remind us that life does not only bloom in fields, it blooms wherever it is given a chance, even in a borrowed breeze, in the shallow soil of a window box, in the outstretched hand of someone who chooses to grow. Some gardens are planted not in peace, but in longing, created by hands far from Home by those who have lost a country or a language or a family name. These gardens carry memory in their root, seeds smuggled in coat linings, cuttings wrapped in damp cloth, a handful of soil from a homeland now gone. They grow in places where the gardener is still learning the light, still finding the rhythm of new seasons. But what they bring forth is familiar, the scent of childhood, the taste of a grandmother's soup, the bloom that once lined a village, road, for refugees, migrants, and the displaced. A garden can be an anchor, a small act of reclamation, even when everything else has changed, when the house is temporary, the papers uncertain, the neighbors strangers. The act of planting something known is a way of saying, I am still here, I remember, I belong. In wartime, gardens have also been a form of quiet resistance, in internment camps and prison yards, in occupied cities and refugee settlements. People have cleared patches of earth with spoons and hands. They've planted onions, sunflowers, beans. They've built trellises from scrap wood and shaped flower beds from broken bricks. These were not only gardens of survival, but of spirit, a declaration that beauty still mattered, that life could still unfurl green and whole in a place built to forget it, and when peace comes or when it doesn't. But the journey continues. Some take their gardens with them, a clipping tucked into a book, a seed kept safe in a locket, a knowledge passed on to a child. This is how we grew cucumbers in the old place. This is how we brewed tea from hibiscus. This is the smell of home when it rains. There are also those who return after years, decades, even generations. They find the land changed, the trees taller or gone, the fence posts rotted, but the soil remembers. They plant again, not to recreate what was, but to begin anew in conversation with memory. A garden that honors both departure and arrival. Gardens of exile and return do not always bloom easily. The climate may be harsh, the past may ache, but still a sprig of mint takes root, a pomegranate tree leans toward the sun, and the gardener stands quietly in the middle, no longer only a stranger, no longer only from elsewhere, but a part of the land now too, their story growing leaf by leaf into something that lasts. In the quiet folds of the countryside, a field of barley might seem like a simple thing, golden and swaying, soft with the rhythm of wind. But beneath its roots lie histories of kings, and taxes of soldiers, and supply chains of empires that measured their power in loaves and rations rather than swords alone. By the time the modern age approached, the garden and the field were no longer just sources of food for families. They were cogs in larger machines, machines that fed not just mouths, but governments, armies, entire systems of power. For centuries, rulers had understood that a well-fed army marched farther. In medieval France, grain from peasants' fields was tallied not only for winter survival, but for the provisioning of campaigns. In the Ottoman Empire, farming villages along major roads were tasked with feeding traveling soldiers, their stores carefully counted and requisitioned. In imperial China, granaries were established in each province, monitored with bureaucracy so meticulous it could rival the movement of stars. If a harvest failed, or a road was blocked, or a river dried too soon, people would not simply go hungry, they might rebel. The pulse of a government was felt in the rhythm of its planting cycles. In times of war, fields near castles were stripped clean, not for defense, but for sustenance. Livestock were driven miles to provide milk and meat. Peasant women needed dough not for their children, but for distant generals. Gardens within city walls became ration plots. In London during the 17th century, when civil war loomed, the fields of surrounding parishes were counted and taxed according to how many men they could feed. In the colonies of the Americas, European powers demanded that land be cleared not just for crops, but for exports, sugar, cotton, tobacco, yes, but also wheat, barley, rye, which could be shipped home or stored for soldiers abroad. Governments began to regulate planting, what could be grown, where, when, a noble family might be required to rotate fields not for fertility, but because oats were needed that season in the king's storehouses. A tenant farmer might lose part of his barley not to a bad harvest, but to a conscription cart bound for the coast. In Russia, the Tsars imposed grain quotas so steep that some villages had barely enough left to bake their black rye bread. In France, the gabella salt tax was enforced so fiercely that pickling and preserving, essential to storing food, became acts of resistance, and yet still people grew. In small plots beside the state fields, women tucked away parsley and chives, children unnoticed scattered pumpkin seeds behind storage sheds. Men planted onions along fence lines where the taxman did not look. The garden, even under the weight of empire, remained a place of quiet defiance, a place where life continued, a little beyond the reach of scrolls and signatures. As revolutions stirred and governments changed, the relationship between field and state deepened. In the 19th century, with industrialization and the rise of standing armies, fields were surveyed, measured, and optimized. The science of use became a tool of empire. Colonial powers in Africa and Asia instructed native farmers to grow cassava, or maize or rice, not for themselves, but for distant markets and faraway troops. During World War I and II, entire campaigns were supported not just by strategy or weaponry, but by bread, rations of hard biscuits, canned meats, dried fruits made possible only by the farmers who rose before dawn to till the earth. Victory gardens returned, this time in backyards and city parks. Posters encouraged citizens to dig for victory. Housewives turned flower beds into potato rows. School children learned to plant carrots in window boxes. Food was no longer just nourishment, it was morale. It was national spirit. A cabbage leaf became a badge of participation. But beneath this patriotic veneer, the garden's ancient roots endured. People still turned soil with care, still watched the clouds, still leaned close to smell the mint, even in war, even under ration. The rhythm of growing was slow, deliberate, human, a reminder that before kings and presidents, before taxes and treaties, there was this, the seed, the hand, the earth. By midsummer, the gardens at the edges of villages burst into bloom. Not in formal beds, but in unruly ribbons, rows of beans climbing makeshift poles, marigolds lining potato plots, cabbages nestled between clumps of mint where fences divided one family's ground from another. Flowering vines crept upward, nasturtiums, morning glories, sweet peas, all leaning together in gentle chaos, like the laughter of neighbors drifting across shared hedgerows. In old European towns, walls became gardens too. The south-facing sides of stone barns were covered in espaliered fruit trees, apples and pears shaped over ears into tidy fans against the stone. Their blossoms arrived like lace in spring, and in autumn the fruit would be picked with reverence and placed in cellars layered with straw. Ivy draped abandoned cottages. Roses spilled across crumbling walls. These living boundaries didn't separate so much as soften. They held stories too, initials carved into bark, ribbons left behind after harvest festivals, the places where a child first climbed and saw beyond. In monasteries and walled gardens of the Middle Ages, walls served another purpose. They held warmth. Inside the cloister, brick and stone absorbed sunlight by day and returned it slowly through the night, stretching the season for figs and fennel. Medicinal plants nestled into corner, sage, hyssop, valerian, each one catalogued and tended with devotion. These enclosed gardens were places of study and prayer, yes, but also of deep listening. A monk might spend years learning when to cut lavender, or how long to steep comfrey root. The wall marked not a limit, but a frame, a way to focus attention on the world within. In later centuries, the kitchen gardens of estates took this idea further. The walled gardens of England and France became feats of horticultural engineering. Heated walls with flues running through them allowed peaches to ripen in cool climates. Glass houses tucked into corners lengthened the life of cucumbers and lemons. Espalier patterns were drawn up in journals and passed down through generations, part science, part art, wholly patient. And yet, even within these precise geometries, wildness crept in. Birds nested beneath grapevines, moss softened the bricks, dandelions found their way through cracks and were not always pulled. For everyday people, the flowering wall was often humbler, a stretch of honeysuckle along a shed, a vine of beans coiled around a broomstick, sunflowers growing tall beside, laundry lines, but no less loved. These small spaces offered not just food, but beauty, a flash of gold in the corner of the eye, a scent that lingered on fingers long after the leaves had been brushed aside. In cities, walls became canvases for vertical gardens, tomatoes growing from hanging bags, window boxes brimming with basil, urban rooftops painted green with thyme and peppers, each pot a note in a larger song, and always the flowering wall was a place of meeting, between plant and stone, between shade and sun, between the hands of those who planted and the eyes of those who passed by and paused, if only for a moment, to see what had been grown. It was, in its own way, a quiet kind of poetry, a line drawn not in ink but in bloom. There is something almost sacred about a seed, small enough to slip between fingers, to tuck into a pocket or a fold of cloth. It asks little, only time, only care, and yet holds everything. The memory of the plant it once was, the promise of the plant it will become. Long before books or banks, before borders, and even before many spoken languages, seeds were kept, passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, across rivers, across oceans, across centuries. A woman leaving her homeland, knowing she may never return, hides a few dried beans in the hem of her apron. A grandfather, too old to work the land, presses sunflower seeds into his grandson's palm and tells him how his own father grew them. Not too deep water in the morning, watch for birds. A child helps their mother sift through a jar of saved tomato seeds, choosing which ones are ready, which ones still need drying. These quiet acts, so small, are how knowledge survives, how culture survives, how life survives. In ancient Mesopotamia, clay tablets recorded the planting of barley and dates, but the real record was in the seeds themselves. Farmers saved only the best, the fullest grains, the sweetest fruit. Over time, these choices shaped the plants that would feed civilizations. Corn, once a wild grass, became golden cobs under the care of countless unknown hands. Rice, wheat, millet, lentils, all sculpted slowly by gardeners who knew their soil, knew the seasons, and knew to save just enough for next year. The seeds in one's pocket are more than food. They are intention. They are belief in tomorrow. When enslaved Africans were taken from their homelands, some braided seeds into their hair. Okra, black-eyed peas, yams, carried across oceans, planted in strange soil, they became not only nourishment but connection, a thread to the past, planted in hope of a future. During times of famine and war, seeds became currency. In Soviet Russia, during the siege of Leningrad, botanists at the Vavilov Institute starved to death surrounded by stored seeds, refusing to eat them, knowing their importance to the generations to come. In Ireland, after the potato blight, people carried new varieties in their boots, hoping to start again. Even now, in a world of frozen seed vaults and digital databases, there are still old women who wrap seeds in paper, label them with fading ink, and send them to neighbors. A zucchini from Aunt Marta, a cucumber that came from your uncle's garden, the one on the hill. Saving seeds is not only about preservation, it is about relationship with the plant, with the land, with the story of those who grew it before. Each time a seed is kept, it says, this plant mattered, this flavor mattered, this story mattered. So we tuck them away in tins and envelopes, in pockets and jars. We keep them close. And when the time is right, we plant them again, because the garden does not begin with soil, It begins with the seed, and the seed begins with a hand willing to save it.